Hola, buenos dias, good morning, and thank you, Mariola, for the introduction. I look at this AI message behind me, and something in my brain sees the Mexican Spanish. Ay. I'm as excited as you are by digital technology, artificial intelligence, and so on. But we're going to have some very exciting adventures on the way. So every morning I wake up and I see this sort of imagery from, for example, the James Webb telescope. What exciting times we live in today. We really do. I'm going to talk about challenges. I'm going to talk about risks. But behind those also are huge opportunities for all of us. And I'm really looking forward to hearing on this Exponential Day the presentations of some of the prize winners, because I think Barcelona is this extraordinary concentration of innovative enterprises. And thank you, Accio, for the invitation to speak here today. The words there are attributed to Nelson Mandela, but go back to the 1700s. This idea that the impossible takes a little longer is very much central to the work that we do. So I'm going to talk very quickly about a series of themes. The first one is we face a systemic crisis. We're not very good as a species at thinking systemically. I'm going to talk about three horizons of change that are before us. I'm going to reference Nassim Nicholas Taleb's work on black swans and put alongside that the idea of green swans. I will talk very briefly about artificial intelligence because I think it's absolutely central. I don't think we can achieve anything like sustainability without AI. And then I'm going to talk about the way in which this agenda of ours, this change agenda, is increasingly becoming political. I think it has to, but it means that we're going to have to start behaving and thinking in a very different way. So I'm 74. I should be retiring, but I feel the next 10 to 15 years are going to be by far the most exciting, challenging, and politically dangerous of my entire working life. And I'll explain to some degree why that is the case. The book on the right, Green Swans, came out in 2020, basically looking at the future of capitalism and hoping that we might get something like regenerative capitalism. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But if I just point you've all seen these diagrams coming out in the recent weeks. Greenland ice, North Atlantic, sea temperatures, Antarctica. It's extraordinary what's going on and what the environmental science is now telling us. We are suddenly going into completely uncharted waters. And young people know that. Young people are increasingly protesting that this is not simply about incremental change. Increasingly, this has to be about systemic change. So very quickly around that system-level side of our agenda. On the left, on the right, you have the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report diagram that came out in January of this year. And what's interesting, I've tracked this work since it began at the forum. And now everything is linking to everything else. It's like a Gordian knot. Suddenly, you can't do anything without influencing other things. And so climate crisis is in there, but so many other things like the cost of living crisis and refugees and so on in there as well. And many people hope that ESG, environment, social governance, investment, and thinking will save us. I think it's a very useful stepping stone. And I think it's quite interesting now that you're getting the pushback. So BlackRock, who Larry Fink, CEO there, put his weight behind the ESG agenda, now being very, very forcefully attacked by the right wing in the United States. States like Texas, Louisiana, Florida, dropping BlackRock for their fund management. I mean, it's costing those states a lot more money to do that, so it's ideological, not, I think, very sensible. But I think that ESG pushback is an indication that the change agenda is now going into the mainstream. As it starts to go into the mainstream, the politics will become, as I say, very much more important. I won't go through the evidence that is increasingly on the media channels the whole time, but I will reference this. Financial markets around the world are struggling to understand what's happening and the implications of what's happening. And Stuart Kirk, who was then at HSBC, the bank, I think did us all a service last year by saying publicly what many of us suspect, is that the financial markets do not care if Miami or Florida goes underwater in 100 years. It's not part of the algorithms. It's not part of the mindset. He lost his job as a result of that, but I think it is an example of somebody speaking, unfortunately, the truth. And some of you will know the work of Hyman Minsky, who was an economist who died in 1996. I came across his work after he had died. And you will know of Minsky moments, where in that case, economies or financial systems start to part company with reality. And I think that's what's happened with our financial markets and the climate and biodiversity crises. And there is going to be a correction, whether we like it or not. And that's the nature of the systemic crisis that we now face. Then, as I said, I don't think we're very good at thinking systemically. We can all press a button and update our software, update our operating system on our computers and all the rest of it. But it's not quite so easy when you come to the problems that we now face. So in 2011, The Economist did an issue, front cover story on the Anthropocene. Scientists are still struggling to work out whether we are in the Anthropocene. But next year, 2024, I think we will see that fact declared as a scientific fact. And that has huge implications for us all. And isn't it extraordinary? If you look at Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, and you track what that man, that brave man, has been saying in recent months. Who would have thought the Secretary General of the United Nations, a body set up to be apolitical, would start to attack the fossil fuels industry, almost calling fossil fuels companies criminal? It's an astonishing time, and he sees things, I think, and is prepared to talk about them in a way that most politicians at the moment are not. This is a strange image, but most of my work over the last 45, 50 years has been working with individual companies and trying to clean them up, make them more responsible, make them more transparent, make them more accountable. Increasingly, that feels like cleaning up fish and putting them back in polluted waters. And that, again, is the nature of the systemic crisis that we face. It's not enough to work with individual companies or their supply chains. We've increasingly got to work with markets, and that's a political challenge. This is a set of principles that the System Change Lab in the United States talks about, and I won't read through them all, but I think they're very good advice. It looks quite simple advice. It's very often the case that leaders in politics, in business, in the financial markets do not take this advice. But absolutely at the center of these principles, there is this point about understanding systems, what goes on within systems and between them. Now, just very quickly, these horizons of change. This is central to the work that we do. But a couple of years ago, well, actually, back in 2018, we did what was called the first ever, this is the Harvard Business Review, said it was the first ever product recall of a management concept. The management concept was the triple bottom line, which I'd come up with in 1994, people, planet, and profit. And the cartoon, I had a Financial Times cartoonist do for me back in 1991. And it's oddly, the cartoon has become more relevant since it was done. And at the time, the idea was that the fish in the business suit in pinstripes was representing the natural world, natural capital. The woman, the global south, the social agenda, continually becoming more complex, more urgent. And the robot initially was there simply as a joke. I mean, let's think about the long term. So 3001 on the robot's shoulder flash. But increasingly now, particularly with big data and expert systems and AI, I think the robot is starting to stand for something rather different. And it's interesting now to start seeing companies like Patagonia making Earth their main shareholder, their only shareholder. Companies appointing the Atlantic by proxy to their boards. There's something starting to happen, very small scale at the moment, but that cartoon, I think, is becoming, as I say, more relevant. I love what the B Corporation movement is doing. We incubated B Lab UK for 9 months. We were the first B Corporation in the United Kingdom. But I don't think they go far enough. Even with 6,000 plus B Corporations around the world, it's not yet sufficiently, I think, systemic, although they are beginning to think about campaigning politically on the system side. So these are the three horizons. And when I stood back from that Harvard Business Review article, and I thought, why am I so dissatisfied with the way the triple bottom line has been put into practice? The answer was fairly simple, that most of the companies that had adopted that sort of thinking, and now ESG, were thinking about responsibility. How could they be nicer? How could they be better? How could they be more transparent, and so on? That's all very nice to have, but what we're beginning to see is in area after area after area of our economies, our societies, of the wider natural environment, we're seeing wobbling. Things are starting to sort of come apart. So that's the period of resilience. So one of the really striking things I've noticed in talking to political and business leaders in recent years, they're talking about resilience. And I don't think that's accidental. I think it's a reflection of what's going on in that wider world of ours. Then you ask yourself, how do you build increasingly systems that are resilient? Economic, social, environmental, political, governance, and so on. The only answer I know is to regenerate them. And that is why I think the concept of regeneration is so important. And one of the things we're starting to see is people in public, powerful people, asking the question, what side of history are we on? What side of history do we want to be on? One of the first people to do that was the then CEO of Shell. And his view was they were still, as an oil company, on the right side of the history. I think that's going to change very, very rapidly indeed. Unfortunately, the builds that were in these slides are not there now, so everything is slammed on top of everything else. But in this particular case, I was going to make a very simple point. Increasingly, and this is particularly true in this part of the world, people are fascinated by unicorns. I heard about 6 new unicorns in Catalonia just last night. Fantastic. This is the new economy evolving very rapidly around the world. Question, who is going to talk to, or who is talking to those unicorn companies, businesses, about climate, about biodiversity, about sustainability, about human rights, these sorts of things? And when I visit some of these companies, the answer very often is almost no one. Because our movement, our change movement, our industry is focused on the companies we can see, the big companies, the big brand companies, the multinationals, not yet on some of these emergent companies. Now this chart goes back to 2015, 2016, and what you saw in very short order was this huge, great burst of innovation and enterprise and investment. And we went to hundreds of unicorns. So now something like 1,200 unicorns around the world, 200 of those in China. Again, the question, who is talking to them about our agenda? And I think we need to do that fairly urgently. A couple of thoughts around swans. As I referenced Nassim Nicholas Taleb's work on the black swan. I don't need to repeat that here. But this sort of diagram showing exponential dynamics, it's been around for 8, 9, 10 years. Singularity University and others have used it repeatedly. But I still think it holds fundamental wisdom and insight about where we are in all of this at the moment. Things have been changing for decades, and they're out of sight, and very often they're going slower than we'd want them, but there's an inflection point coming, and it's coming increasingly rapidly. And it doesn't take us to heaven, it doesn't automatically take us to hell, but it takes us in several directions at the same time, and political leadership is going to be really important. And the two cars are there, just to make a very simple point. When the Model T came out, everyone thought that was the pinnacle, the peak of technology. What they couldn't see is what that sort of product would do to our world. Now, again, with the Model Y from Tesla, you've got people thinking this is the pinnacle of technology. What they're not seeing is where that will take us, the linkages between different technologies that you're starting to see in the automotive sector and many other sectors as well. So I'm not going to read this out, but this again is what I mean by a green swan. It's an exponential trend in markets, in politics, that begin to address the exponential character of the challenges that we face and begin to go after the exponential opportunities that are opening up all around us. And I think the Green New Deal in the European Union was one early attempt to go after that. As I say, these technologies are hybridizing, they're linking up in all sorts of different ways. Very exciting time. What you're beginning to see is companies behaving in a very different way in response to those trends. It's no longer producing a report, having a stakeholder dialogue. Companies are starting to break themselves up. Now, in the case of Sequoia Capital, the venture capital outfit in the United States, they've split out part of their business because of the China issue. But with Ford, I worked with Bill Ford when he was CEO back at the beginning of this century. And if you had told Bill and his board that eventually the company would split itself in two, one part doing internal combustion engines, one part doing electric vehicles, you'd have been laughed out of the room. And yet they've done that now. Solvay, to bring the story home to Europe, has split their business in two. And what's really interesting is that the one that's tilting into the emerging economy, lightweighting, energy efficiency, all of this good stuff, is already significantly bigger than the legacy buildings. So I think increasingly we're going to see this. We're going to see the structural response to these sorts of challenges. Now, the robot was at the end of the table in the cartoon. I'm just going to focus very quickly on that digital and AI agenda. I think most of us fear for our jobs. When I try and write an article now, and I ask whatever the latest version of ChatGPT might be, write the article for me, and then write it for a chief financial officer, and then write it for a 15-year-old schoolgirl or whatever. It does it. It's astonishing the power of this technology, even at this elementary stage. God knows what it's going to do next. But as I say, I'm optimistic. I think we will learn to use these technologies for the better if we think soon enough and in the right way. And I'm very excited about not just the digital twinning of our bodies, where we can sort of start to experiment with drug regimes and so on without actually doing it in our bodies in real time. But I was a part of a conference earlier this year which was talking about the digital twinning of the planet, where you can suddenly start to run much more sophisticated models on what's going on with climate, with biodiversity, with soils, and so on. So I think AI has a huge amount to offer, and as I say, I think we can't do sustainability justice without it. We can't actually make that happen without AI. But some of you will have read James Cameron, the filmmaker's comments after the Titan submersible imploded near the Titanic. And I think he's right. What he was saying was that the same mindset that put the Titanic into that collision with the iceberg was seen again in the people behind the Titan submersible, and we probably will see exactly the same mindsets applying in the world of AI. Question, how do we pick those trends up soon enough and start to address them, manage them in the right way? Just a few concluding comments around the politicization of the change agenda, why it's becoming so much more political, and in some ways needs to. The picture of the underwater board meeting was the Maldives some years back, and it was just meant to dramatize the fact that some countries in the world are actually literally now beginning to go underwater. We need that to be politically acknowledged. But then what a travesty, what an extraordinary outcome for the next Conference of the Parties, the next climate summit, to be run effectively by the oil industry. I mean, it is extraordinary that we've allowed that to happen. I will be in Dubai. I don't like these COP summits, but we have to be there. But I think we've got to pay very, very great attention to what the fossil fuels industry will do to fight back to against the necessary changes. And we've seen this in different countries around the world in different ways. On the left there, you have Scott Morrison, when he was Prime Minister of Australia, coming into the Parliament building with a lump of coal and saying, "This is the future." Well, it isn't the future. Coal isn't the future, oil isn't the future, natural gas will be squeezed increasingly. What was interesting in Australia is Scott Morrison, for his idiocy, was voted out. One of the earliest elections where social and environmental factors were really, really important. Tony Albanese came in instead. And you just had something similar in Brazil, where Bolsonaro was voted out, and Lula came back in. And since Lula came back in, I mean, he's not perfect in any way, but you had something like a third reduction in the pace of tropical deforestation, particularly in Amazonia. So this is becoming politically mainstream. We're going to have to treat it increasingly in that way. Joe Biden. I don't know what will happen in the next US election. I really don't know what's going to happen in that next election. But I think Biden is trying his best to address some of the very big challenges, not just the United States faces, but the world faces. And I think the Inflation Reduction Act is beginning to signal the nature and scale of the challenges that we now face, and the level of resource, financial resource, technical resource, and so on, that we're going to have to start pushing at these sorts of problems. This is my last but one slide. A couple of years ago, in the heart of a financial institution in London's financial centre, the city, we did a big conference, a bit like this, and on the walls, we put up a message. And some people who came from the financial sector thought that that message was a little bit provocative, because they thought they were doing God's work by addressing ESG. And we said, you're taking a stepping stone moment to move in the right direction, but ESG is not the answer. This is a systemic crisis. We've got to address it. It's increasingly political. We've got to do the politics. And the message was very simple. And I think it's a message that should apply to all of us, whatever we do, wherever we do it. Step up or get out of the way. My final slide is this one, and it's just simply, a lot of what I talk about sounds for younger people really challenging, and it is. That's the reality that we face. But again, I think this image with the dark clouds, but the renewable energy working in the foreground, is a symbol, in a way, of where we now find ourselves in all of this. At one of the most exciting points in terms of innovation, in terms of technology, in terms of politics, and particularly, and this is an area that I think Barcelona is particularly strong, in the cultural reaction to understanding of the science and then taking the necessary action. My email address is there, john@volans.com. I answer every email. So since we can't do a discussion now, if you have questions or comments, or you want to be rude later on quietly, you have my email. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you.